So we've talked about Catherine of Siena before. Remember her? She was a young woman who heard voices that told her to come save the papacy from corruption and disease, and she did. She got the Pope and all his court moved back to Rome from Avignon, where they'd been living in luxury for like 70 years, and then died of the plague shortly thereafter. Well, another Italian woman around the same age as Catherine, but living in a different part of Italy, heard other voices and did other things. Let me introduce you to Margaret of Trent. See? The thing about having a reputation as a miracle-working saint is that it tends to attract the attention of the secular authorities as well as the religious ones. And both were extremely suspicious of Margaret and her powers. The local bishop sent a commission to investigate her. First, they grilled Margaret for 5 days about her visions and powers. And even though he struggled to find a foothold in the mountains, he used his time there to write many tracts condemning the Catholic Church. And here's where our story intersects with that of Margaret of Trent. The Bishop of Verona, who was still suspicious of her powers, ordered that she be burned alive. Margaret was executed in 1297 and Dolcino in 1307. However, the fact that they were both tortured and killed for their beliefs makes their stories fit nicely together. Margaret are remembered as martyrs, and their ideas lived on long after they were dead. Dolcino's followers, known as the Apostolic Brethren, continued to grow in number throughout the 14th century, even though they kept getting wiped out by the authorities. And parts of Dolcino's writings turned up in the New Testament of the Protestant Bible. Meanwhile, Margaret was never officially canonized by the Roman Catholic Church, but she was revered as a saint for centuries. A number of churches are named after her, and she is included in a list of local saints printed in the back of the breviary, an official Roman Catholic prayer book. They both attracted large followings by claiming to speak for God, both were branded heretics, and both were eventually killed for it. In fact, there are some scholars who believe that Dolcino may have known about Margaret and her supposed miracles, and may have even attended one of her public demonstrations. Others say Margaret was so troubled by Dolcino's violent rhetoric that she prayed to God to smite him. But regardless of their relationship, their fates were intertwined. She was placed in a wooden box with some other women suspected of being heretics and thrown into a fire. But true to form, Margaret survived the initial blaze. Margaret would likely be disturbed by the people who prayed to her for favors, and Dolcino wouldn't want anyone to remember him as anything less than an equal brother in Christ. And thanks to our supporters for helping us make these videos possible. But maybe that's what happens when you die a violent death. Your story gets retold until it becomes legend, and legends never stay true to the original. The bishop then ordered that 2 red-hot musket balls be dropped down the chimney to kill her, but she survived that too. Finally, they pushed her out of the chimney with a pitchfork and threw in her 8-year-old son to finish the job. Dolcino was paraded through the streets to show the crowds what a heretic looked like. He was placed on a chair in the Piazza Vittorio Emanuele and read from a papal bull condemning him as a heretic and revoking his right to appeal to any earthly court, and when asked to recant his statements, he refused. The sentence was carried out the next day on Mount Scuderi. Dolcino was tied to a wooden horse and torn limb from limb with heated pincers. Then they ripped out his tongue and cut off his head. As he was dying, he shouted, "Strike, strike, you villains, that I may die more quickly and go to God more speedily." He railed against the power and wealth of the clergy, called for priests to return to a life of poverty, and claimed that salvation could only be achieved by the grace of God and not through indulgences or good works. And since he was always surrounded by armed men, Dolcino felt safe enough to continue writing and preaching, even calling for an end to all forms of government, saying such things would only disappear when Christ returned to earth. In fact, Dolcino even managed to hold out against the papal armies for a full 8 months. But eventually, his forces ran out of food. It's not clear how many of his followers died of starvation or exposure, but most of the survivors eventually came down from the mountain to surrender to the local duke. Then they put her to a series of tests that she passed easily. One of the more dramatic ones involved a bishop holding a red-hot musket ball in his hand and Margaret placing her bare foot on it. Still, though, the bishop wasn't convinced. He took her to the nearby town of Verona, where a group of theologians put her through 3 days of questioning, which she passed, but only narrowly. And even though she was cleared of heresy, this experience left her shaken. She was already married, had a kid on the way, and could unjust go off wandering the countryside healing people, and performing miracles. Now Margaret also heard voices telling her what to do. That would be Brother Dolcino of Navarra, an ex-priest who claimed that he, too, heard voices from God and claimed that the Pope was actually the Antichrist. He saw the rampant corruption among the clergy and thought that priests had strayed too far from the teachings of Christ. In fact, Dolcino believed the entire Catholic Church needed to be burned to the ground. He wrote, "When the Lord shall come to visit and bring fire to his threshing floor, he will gather his winnowing fan and will purge his floor and his granary. That is, he will punish those who have transgressed the law and committed iniquity." But unlike Margaret, Dolcino wasn't content with just performing miracles and saving people from their sins. He wanted to save them from something a little more tangible. Dolcino organized a commune in northern Italy and declared it independent from papal authority. He attracted many followers and became quite powerful until his rival, the Marquis of Saluzzo, accused him of murdering a fellow nobleman and killed several of his men. This led Dolcino and his remaining followers to flee into the Italian Alps. We'll get to that in a bit. For now, let's talk about why exactly Dolcino was so controversial. But unlike Catherine, Margaret didn't have much choice about whether or not to listen to them because they would unshut up. Margaret started hearing these voices when she was just 12 years old. As soon as she could, she told the local priest, but he just laughed at her. So then she went to visit a more senior priest, and he basically told her to shut up and stop making up these ridiculous stories. So she stopped talking about the voices entirely and just listened to them instead. Fast forward about 6 years, and Margaret has married a man named Uguccione della Sila, had a kid with him, and is living a seemingly normal life. But one day, while she's kneading bread, the voices start yelling at her again, bars with her mind. Just know that she would not only tear bread in half by simply thinking about it, but she would also later go on to split stones and bend iron, and people witnessed all of this. At first, Margaret tried to keep her visions and powers secret, but the voice commanded her to go to a nearby church and perform miracles, which she did. According to her biographers, a woman who'd been lame for 9 years was healed after Margaret laid hands on her. Margaret also cured a boy who was blind and deaf, raised a dead child, cured a woman who had a tumor the size of a fist, and even brought a dead bird back to life by holding its corpse and praying over it. And it wasn't just the lame, the blind, and the dead that Margaret helped. She also saved a house from collapsing, a ship from sinking, a widow from going bankrupt, and a prisoner from execution. All this Margaret did in the name of God, and she quickly gained a reputation as a saintly woman who performed miracles. So she does, and the bread tears. And so crowds began following her everywhere she went, and tell her to tear the bread in her hands. And at this point, Margaret realizes these aren't just random voices in her head. These are messages from God himself, and her life will never be normal again. In fact, if you want to get a vague idea of how many crazy things Margaret will do over the next few years, and this is when Margaret's problems really started. But there was someone else who didn't seem to mind the constant crowds. Someone whose fame was growing alongside Margaret's. Aucini, a former priest, had become disenchanted with the church during his time studying theology in Paris. Now, Dolcino wasn't your average heretic. He was intelligent, charismatic, and driven. Dolcino, however, refused to surrender and fought to the death against a force 4 times his size. He was captured and brought back to Navarra. And speaking of speedy deaths, Margaret of Trent was killed almost as violently, although hers was technically a bit slower. Now, the thing about Margaret and Dolcino's executions is that they happened at very different times. The last thing Dolcino said as he was torn apart was, "Here today, there tomorrow," which is pretty fitting since both neither Dolcino nor Margaret would probably be happy with their reputations. Hey everyone, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, don't forget to subscribe for more historical tales.